In 1947, just months before the modern state of Israel was to be born, a dramatic discovery came to light. A massive cache of ancient documents, scrolls, discovered in a series of caves in a very forbidding part of Israel, in the Judean desert, not too far from the Dead Sea, hence the name Dead Sea Scrolls. The series of caves were located around a community known as Qumran, an ancient community long since abandoned, and this promised to be the library of that community. And the documents dated to approximately 150 before the Common Era to the Great Revolt of 66 through 73 of the Common Era, and they promised to shed a tremendous amount of light on the nature of Jewish society in this incredibly important time, including a discussion perhaps of what it must have been like for the early Christians in this period. So let's have a very quick look at the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves and ask some questions about who wrote them and what exactly do they say. So here's a map of the modern state of Israel on a satellite, and as you can see when we zoom in a little bit, the Qumran region and the caves are just to the west of the northern part of the Dead Sea. The location of these caves as a possible source of documents was actually known long before 1947, and documents would occasionally trickle out onto the black market, but the major discovery came out in 1947. Here's a look at the topography of the region. You can see these caves are far up in the hillside, and this would be a place where many outcasts from society or rebels against the regime, like the Bar Kokhba rebels, would ultimately be hiding out. And they're very difficult to get to and a great place to hide things. The arid climate also helped preserve these documents, which proved to be absolutely fantastic. As I mentioned, the collection was positively dated from about 135 before the Common Era to about 68 of the Common Era, which exactly sandwiches the late period of the Hashmonaim, the reign of King Herod, the rise of the rabbis, all of these fantastic things, and of course the period of the birth of Christianity right up until the Great Revolt. So a very important period in Jewish history and indeed in world history, and so what these documents had to say really captured the world's attention. One thing for sure was fascinating early on is that when these documents were painstakingly opened up, it was discovered that they had a tremendous number of biblical fragments in there. Typically not entire samples of works, but there are pieces of the entire Hebrew scriptures, with the exception, interestingly, of the book of Esther. And there are also many other documents in here that say a lot about what it must have been like to be Jewish at this particular point in history. So who were the authors of these documents, especially the ones other than the biblical texts, which of course were copied from earlier texts? We know quite a bit about the Qumran community. This, by the way, is an aerial view of their settlement. The documents were found far away in small caves that were quite inaccessible. So obviously they must have stored them there for safekeeping, and this was not actually where they lived. They lived down in the valley in these large communal areas. They describe their own community, particularly in many of their manuals of discipline, which are recorded in the scrolls, and so we get a sense of who they were, or at least how they lived. We know that the members of the Qumran community were Jewish, that they observed communal property, that is, that they were lived in a kind of, if you will, a strange kind of religious kibbutz-like environment where all property was held in common, but they had a very highly defined sense of religious mores. They dressed all in white. They had a very strict regimen of maintaining personal purity with a great series of ablutions after, relieving oneself and so on. And they had, all kinds of rituals about how they would gather in silence and eat twice a day, with higher status people receiving the food first. And, really fascinating kind of things that talk to us about the specifics of their day. We know that they valued celibacy, although it's not clear if they were actually celibate. So it may be that celibacy was considered some kind of ideal, perhaps after one had had children. Of course, having children, by the way, is a very positive ideal in Judaism as a whole, and so they would not have been able to exempt themselves from this until after they had fulfilled that quota, at least if they were thinking like the Pharisees would in the Masoretic tradition. They may be the so-called Essenes, a mysterious group that are named in Josephus, and a lot of the behaviors that they indicate are those that the Essenes would have held. In their own documentation, they never refer to themselves as Essenes, though, so it's hard to make this label stick. The term Essene is of dubious etymology. It does not appear to be a Hebrew word. Josephus uses obviously the Greek alphabet is all that survived of his description of them, and there's a lot of guesses as to what that name actually could mean. But what the Qumran community call themselves are the Sons of Light. They often contrast themselves with other groups, and again, it's tempting to try and attach these labels to other groups that we know existed. There are the Sons of Darkness. Perhaps those are the Sadducees, and some theories point to the possibility that perhaps the Qumran community were like disaffected Sadducees. Certainly their hyper attention to purity issues are not unlike those requirements that would have been mandatory for the Kohanim, and perhaps they felt that the perversion of the temple ritual under Herod required them to separate, maybe even earlier, maybe even during the Maccabean period, they may have separated. These are all questions. They also have a teacher of righteousness, which may have been some kind of like historical figure, but it's very difficult to identify which historical figure would that have been. Do we have other records of them? And they also refer to a group of people called the Seekers of Smooth Things, and some have opined that perhaps this refers to the Pharisees, perhaps that refers to the rabbis, because there are elements of the Qumran's community behavior which definitely overlap with Pharisaic ideals as well. These are all great questions that I'm sure over the next century or so people will discover more and more. There's a lot of fascinating things that are being discovered now, for example, looking at the DNA content of the animal skins that were used to write most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As others, one of the most famous ones is written actually on copper. Fascinating. In terms of the content, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls actually say? So, first of all, the biblical texts are instructive in themselves. It is great to know that the biblical texts that are included in the Hebrew Scriptures today were definitely in circulation at the time of Qumran. But the texts that the Qumran community have are mainly fragmentary. They're partial texts, and in some cases they are expanded texts. There are larger books of the Bible, or like a book that we know that is in the Bible today, but the Qumran version is significantly larger and there's more material in it. So there's a lot of material to study here in terms of who these people could have been and how they fit with the rest of the Jewish world at the time. But it does indicate that there is definitely a growing consensus about what would be canonized as the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's generally believed that the full decision was made through the 1st century. Again, the Talmud does not have any extensive discussion of how it was decided to include certain books and others not. There are a few scattered passages, but no systematic discussion of it. What's more fascinating, I think, about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that quite often they have their own commentaries on texts. Like, for example, a commentary on the book of Nahum, which is absolutely fascinating and tells us so much more about how the Qumran community must have viewed themselves vis-a-vis other groups. And as I've mentioned, it's hard to pin down exactly which groups they're referring to because there's so much euphemistic language, but for sure we can determine that they felt that they were on the precipice of the Messianic age, that the Messiah would soon be revealed really within their lifetimes, and they were preparing themselves as a community to be caught up in the new Messianic transformation. This certainly feeds very well into the notion that the first century was just cooking in terms of a spiritual vortex and was ripe for the kind of movement that ultimately would express itself in Christianity, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are giving us a sense of a population that is preparing itself for this kind of moment. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, some fascinating manuals of behavior for conduct, which has overlaps with both the Pharisees, who are very interested in halakha and personal conduct, and also with the Sadducees, who are especially involved in issues of personal purity. And that gives us a general sense, I think, of what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's so much fascinating research, so much that is unknown about them still, but I'm very glad to have been able to talk about it with you for a few minutes. Let's go back now to Judea proper and try to understand something about the birth of Christianity within this larger historical context. Thank you for watching.